Venceremos Brigade. Solidarity work. Also, we were recording. Like Zoom just interrupted me to say. Yeah, so there's a little bit of a history of the Venceremos Brigade for you. And now I kind of want to get into more of a little breakdown of history about Cuba, just so we're all like on the same page of that. So I have figures on here, and I just want to make a note the fact that history is not made by figures, right? It's made by people. But this is how I am trying to visualize each different era. So it starts off in 1492, where literally 1492, Christopher Columbus claims Cuba, the island of Cuba, for Spain. And then moving a little forward within the Spanish colonization era, right, there is one of the first resistance movements by Hatui, an indigenous Cuban, which is Taino, right? And within that nation, there's many nations, but that's in 1512. He's burned at the stake, right? So even then, we're already seeing the back and forth struggle of colonialism. Moving past that to the more wars of independence, you see three figures there. The one that's colored, like has a colored painting, is so not the one on the top, but I guess the one in the middle between the three is Carlos Manuel de Céspedes. And he initiated the first War of Independence from 1868 to 1878. That was called the 10 Years' War. And then there was a second War of Independence with José Martí and Antonio Maceo, which are the other two members there, or figures there. And that was from 1895 to 1898. In 1898, the Treaty of Paris between Spain and the United States ends the Spanish-American War, and that's when Spain lets go of Cuba, and Cuba becomes a colony essentially of the United States of America. So those are kind of like those are the wars of independence, kind of the like national liberation. After 1898, you start and into the beginning part of the 1900s, you start to see more like independence, but really it's like still economically dependent on the United States. So it has like its own president. They elect their their government and all that. And that's when Batista gets elected into president in 1940. Batista was the who Fidel overthrows, right? And so Batista is elected president, then loses presidency, and then seizes power again in 1952, and that's when the dictatorship begins, the Batista dictatorship, which is where we get into the July 26th movement, and that starts in 1953 with Fidel leads an attack on the Moncada barracks. And then that revolution, the July 26th movement, which led, it was a mass uprising, finally wins on January 1st, 1959, 10 years before the Venceremos Brigade begins. And so, yeah, 1959, that's when the revolutionary troops enter Havana. The next part I want to talk about, there is a long history, and I'm going through this quickly as a short little glimpse into Cuban history. So I know it's a lot of information. I just want to acknowledge that. But I want to bring us to the present, right? And so after the July 26th movement, after the masses take power, Fidel Castro, leading that with many others. I don't want to put it on one person. I'm going to skip forward to about the 90s, 1991, with the dissolution of the USSR. The USSR was a strong trading partner with Cuba. And when it fell apart, there was the dissolution in 1991, it lost its main trading partner, and we enter the special period. The special period was a lot of reforms. There was a lot of struggle. There was, a lot of economic hardships, specifically within the state, alongside the embargo, the blockade. And so in 1991, the dissolution of USSR. In 1993, Cuba opened state enterprises to private investment. And in 2000, Cuba once again reestablishes relationships with Russia, but this time it's no longer the USSR, it's Russia. And then we begin to see, especially in the 2000s era, you begin to see it kind of open up again. We kind of are coming out of the special period and into different, I guess, economic upgrowth a little more. And that modern times, you see, Raul Castro, elected president. Fidel Castro steps down in 2008. Obama eases travel restrictions in 2011. In 2016, Fidel Castro dies. And in 2017, Trump rolls back Cuba-US relationships, which is what Yaksha was talking about with the Helms-Burton Act and not waiving a certain part of that. And then just to kind of bring it up to the last couple years, in 2018, Manuel Diaz-Canel is elected president. The 2019 new constitution is passed, and in 2022, the most recent historical event, in September 2022 of last year, the family code is passed. And so that brings us all the way up to now. And this is where all of that information, I know that was a lot, but I hope that gave you a little bit of a glimpse into the history of Cuba. So yeah, I'm going to pass it on over now. Thank you.
Thank you, Boa. Nico, do you want to go before I start?
Oh, sure. We just wanted to do a verbal. I think that Zoom tells you recording in progress, and everyone heard that, but we just want to say that we're recording. In case you didn't see it in the chat, if you want to turn off your video, change your name, whatever you want to do, if you want to keep it on, just letting y'all know.
Thank you. So just a quick thing about the blockade so that there's some context. And thank you, Boa, for that amazing timeline. So it was first implemented by the Eisenhower administration after the revolution in 1959 in an attempt to, quote, create hardship and disenchantment among the people of Cuba to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of the government. And this is verbatim what a memo in the United States record says. This was in the 1960s. Over time, the sanction severity has fluctuated. And then they started with cutting off sugar imports from Cuba and restricting any US exports to the island. And then by 1962, it was a full travel and trade blockade implemented by the Kennedy administration. And then in 1963, all financial transactions were banned unless approved by the United States. There were some ease in restrictions in the 1970s due to international pressure, but in 1977, the United States denied Cuba permission to buy medicines that were only available to US suppliers because Cuba had been militarily supporting the revolutionary independence movements in Angola and in Ethiopia. And then in 1982, similarly, Reagan imposed more sanctions to punish Cuba for supporting revolutionary movements in Central America. And this is when they were added to the State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism, which already had the similar restrictions that the embargo already had, but it made international trade even more difficult. And then 1989, 1991, like Boa mentioned, George H.W. Bush tried to convince, so this is before the end of the Soviet Union, H.W. Bush tried to convince Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the leader of the USSR at the time, to cut economic ties with Cuba in an attempt to end the Cold War. But Gorbachev refused to do that. But then the Soviet Union was dismantled, and Boris Yeltsin, who was the new president of Russia, agreed to cut ties with Cuba, which is why they entered this depression called the Special Period that was mentioned earlier. And then 1992, both Clinton and Bush approved cutting $700 million in trade, mostly in food and medicine. And as well, the US has blocked physical shipments from, in recent times, from Venezuela with fuel. Most recently, there was a shipment of ventilators that was stopped from going to Cuba. And this is in part because the United States illegally occupies a port in Guantanamo province since the beginning of the 1900s. As well, there's so much to it, but since 2014, the United States has fined companies from all over the world, including United States companies, but companies from everywhere, over $2.8 billion for doing business with Cuba, just for doing business with Cuba. So although it's like not in the code, it's not in the restrictions that other places can't do business with Cuba, but you will get fined. So it's extremely incentivized to not do business. And then also, yeah, the current restrictions on Cuba, we mentioned the Helms-Burton Act in 2019 with Trump and him tightening restrictions on travel. It also makes it so that Cubans can't get access to goods that have more than 10% of American components. So imagine being 90 miles off the coast and not being able to get like basic goods. Like there are people who've been waiting for like 15 plus years for ovens, medical supplies and different things that they can't get because they're made with like a technology is a really big part of it, like chips and things like that that are American made. Cubans can't access them. So imagine having to get them from people who will do business with Cuba, which is like China. The fuel costs alone are egregious. But next slide, and that's it for me now. Thanks.
All right. Thank y'all for the history and background on the blockade. So I'm going to be moving us into the next topic that we want to focus on, which is Cuban internationalism as a key part of Cuban foreign policy. So first we need to kind of do a general definition on what we mean when we talk about internationalism. So internationalism is a political approach to combating imperialism because it views the systems that we're fighting against as a global cohesive network, which in turn necessitates a global cohesive struggle against things like capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, neocolonialism, etc. And one of the primary views of internationalism is the importance of acting in solidarity with connected struggles across the globe. So we can move to the next slide. So here is a quote from Castro talking about what internationalism means to him that y'all can read. But here I just want to emphasize that the revolutionary leaders in Cuba viewed liberating people from exploitation and underdevelopment as a global endeavor, as we were just talking about. And so they decided to make the internationalist tradition an explicit sphere of state activity. And so the Cuban revolutionaries view things such as global poverty, poor health and poor health care as a result of the exploitative structural conditions brought on by things like capitalism, imperialism, underdevelopment, etc. So we can do next slide. So I'll be talking about the medical sphere of Cuba's internationalist approach. And again, one of the primary groundings of their approach comes from solidarity and not charity, because I think oftentimes when it comes to things like Doctors Without Borders and FEMA and stuff like that, it can oftentimes be grounded in an approach from charity and altruism, and therefore it can create like a sort of dependency relationship. And the medical internationalism within Cuba is grounded in the principle of solidarity. And so here, we can see some Cuban medical responses across the globe. In a book that I read that was published 3 years ago now, there was this data point of 400,000 Cuban medical professionals having worked in 164 countries since 1960. And that number has only increased in the following 3 years after publication. An interesting kind of little case study is the response to the Ebola epidemic. So originally, when Ebola first broke out in Western Africa, the World Health Organization called for international assistance, and wealthy countries such as the US and Western Europe sent lots of money, like finances and supplies, and also interesting military personnel, but nobody wanted to send their doctors, medics, medical personnel. And so Cuba was actually the first country to respond directly to the appeal for sending medical personnel, and sent the largest contingent to Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. And it's important to note that they already had medical personnel stationed in these countries because as we've seen, like there are medical professionals that are stationed all across the world, primarily within the global South, because again, they're approaching poor health care through an internationalist lens, knowing that it is coming from the global factors of capitalism, imperialism, etc. And so within the Ebola outbreak, Cuba trained over 13,000 people to deal with Ebola in 28 different African countries, and was able to get the outbreak under control after a year and 4 months of being present. And if I remember correctly, there's only one Cuban doctor that actually ended up getting Ebola. And one of the people that we talked to in Cuba, he was sharing the story and was like, this doctor was like, I'm going to be fine and I'm going to go back. And he recovered from Ebola and then went back to, I think, Guinea to continue serving. And then some other examples, you know, Cuba sent doctors to Chernobyl after the nuclear power plant meltdown. They also sent people to Haiti after the incredibly devastating earthquake in 2010. They also offered to send medics to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, which was refused by the US government. So there could have been a much more robust response to that if they had accepted that help. And then not only is one focus having, you know, Cuban trained doctors on the ground in primarily global South countries, there's also, because they're not trying to foster a relationship of dependency, they also intentionally are training local personnel from those countries and from those areas to be able to build sustainable healthcare systems within those communities. And so it is a specific approach that they are financing and giving like free medical school to people coming from like extremely impoverished, like rural areas, from places across Latin America, across Africa, in order to be able to train them to then be, you know, be able to go back home and serve their communities. And there are a couple different ways they do this. They either have med school students come to Cuba to study, and they've developed trainings within like different countries as well. And it was cool because, yeah, there was this one day, this medical student from Haiti was presenting to us and talking about the like coalition of Haitian medical students that she was a part of, and talking about the importance of, you know, being able to study in Cuba for free and then go back to Haiti to provide the needed medical care there. And I just want to say that, like, one of the things that I wasn't able to really get a sense of until I was in Cuba and like hearing from these doctors is like, they are approaching what they do and like the sphere of medical internationalism very much from a political lens, which I think is, it's interesting because like, I feel like Cuba in the mainstream media is oftentimes like demonized politically for being a socialist country, but then at the same time, it can be depoliticized in certain ways where like I had heard a little bit about the Cuban doctors, and the way that I had heard about it at least was very much coming from like a charity, like people talking about it in a charity framework. And then after like hearing the doctors speak about like what is motivating them, I'm like, oh no, this is a deeply, deeply political thing for them. And I think that that's just an important thing to highlight. So with that, I will pass it along to Keegan.
All right, y'all, I'm very grateful to be here with you. I'm gonna go through this in 2 minutes. Okay, so one of the things that we had the privilege of throughout our experience in Cuba was we were in different spaces, in different contexts with people who had served in the Cuban military, from people who had served in the fought in the revolution in the late 1950s, all the way through people who had been there fairly recently. One of the things about that was really remarkable to me is that pretty much and this is personal, and I wonder if people resonate with this, but when I have been around spaces that are like U.S. military spaces, or people who have had experience in the U.S. military, it's often uncomfortable for me for lots of different reasons. And that was not the case at all in Cuba for me. I want to share a quote. So we at the beginning of this slide, it says defensive military, and it's a military that, in the same way that Cuban doctors have gone all over, like Nico said, I think 164 countries in the last like 60 years. The Cuban military has only left the shores of Cuba at the express request of other countries, most of which are to support in liberation struggles against often Western European and US imperialist endeavors. So that was really incredible. Just like there was a swelling of pride that we would hear from different people who had served in the military, because it was a defensive army against US imperialism, and it was an army that had supported explicitly other people in their struggles against the same types of oppression. And one quote that really stuck out with me was, in addition to saying that they'd only ever gone places with the express request of those people, was that the only things that they've ever brought back, they never took resources. It was never about resource expropriation. It was never about, I think Nico said it really well, creating dependency relationships in other nations, but it was about, and so the only things they ever took back were their dead comrades and the pride that they had from supporting those people. And the pride that they felt and the patriotism they felt as a nation that has supported other countries was something that I had never experienced living in the United States. And it like made me want to feel that way about something. And that was like really powerful for me. And my time is up, so I'm going to pass it to my comrade. I think Alex is going to talk a little bit more about the medical stuff.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about, actually, I think there's a slide for this. If there is not, then that's okay. Oh, no. Here we go. Yes. Okay, great. So the brigade went to a pharmaceutical lab where they talked to leading scientists, including the head researcher for the Abdallah COVID vaccine, who is the woman next to the woman in the green shirt in the photo. And so we learned a few different things about the Cuban vaccines and their procedures. So because of the blockade, Cuba wasn't able to get access to the same things that the United States had to make their vaccines. So they had to independently engineer their own, and they've made 5 so far. They are over 92% effective in preventing death and severe symptoms. They're also the first in the world to create a vaccine for 3 to 11-year-olds. As well, they have boosters, and all Cubans are ready for like a new booster. As well, the vaccines are easily exported, and they're being used in 8 other countries so far because of that. So they also talked about the importance of young medical students in the fight against COVID-19, especially when it was first starting. These young medical students went like door to door and contact traced and looked for people with symptoms, which made it made it much more easy to maintain. And they also educated folks about wearing masks, social distancing, the importance of washing hands, etc. You are like over 4 times more likely to die from COVID in the United States than you are in Cuba. It's not a problem the way it is here because of the fact that they targeted it so early, and people actually trust the science, and the science actually works, instead of in the United States where we had big companies that are getting paid over $1,000 per vaccine. That's what Pfizer is getting paid by the government. And these vaccines were pumped out so quickly that we see how easily it is to be reinfected, and they're not nearly as effective. Also, not only the medical cases, yes, like Nick said, when we were there were only 30 cases in the entire country, when we had over hundreds of people die that same day from the United States. They talked about how the doctors and other medical staff, like medical professionals and others, like not just them, but they were paid full salary to stay home, which is another big important part. And they made sure that people who were caring for others and just people in general were able to stay home, and so they could maintain the social distancing. As well, 96% of Cubans at least have one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine, and almost 90% are fully vaccinated, which is just unimaginable in this country. We don't have anything close to that. Thank you. And then we also went to a hospital.
Sorry, can I also add one thing?
Yes, please.
I just want to add, and I think it's important for like the experience part of being in that conversation, is two doctors went up, and before we even knew they were doctors, like sang to us, like they sang a whole song. And I just wanted to point that out because I thought that was an important part of the experience too, is that they were all so culturally, like, I don't know, centered, right? Like they literally had a song, they did a little performance, and then they gave an entire presentation about their vaccine and their medical work. And I just wanted to point that out. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just
No, please. I like I told them, I was actually not able to be at this conversation because of the Southwest flight crisis, so I wouldn't actually get to be there. So I'm glad. You please share anything. But then I was able to be there for this conversation at the Children's Hospital, where the hospital that we went to had been a private hospital before the revolution, and then it was nationalized, and now they serve like over 150,000 people from the time they're born till when they're 18. And it's of course free for Cubans. They talked about the 3 levels of the Cuban medical system, including, so they have the primary level, which is the neighborhood doctors, or 2 nurses per neighborhood. And they talked about this being like the most important level. And was also really crucial in COVID-19 slow, because these neighborhood doctors already knew the people in their neighborhood. They already knew who were more had more comorbidities or were elderly. And so they were able to do like specific treatment for that. And then also one of the doctors while we were there talked about how he mentioned that like the best medicine is one that prevents. So these neighborhood doctors are really about preventing different medical health conditions, and just being that first level of contact. And then the secondary level are the hospitals, the provincial hospitals, like the one we were in. And then if something is more serious, then they have the National Institution in Havana, which is ELAM, the Latin American School of Medicine, which I learned very recently is most likely the largest medical school in the world. And is obviously a place where you can go to medical school for free if you're Cuban, but also they offer free school for people from all over Latin America and the world. The United States, also they accept hundreds of United States students to go for free. We also talked about how the blockade impacts the medical shortages. So the blockade impacts every aspect of Cuban life, but thank you, Keegan. They have syringes, like they had medical shortages for syringes, medicines, lab materials, specialized equipment. It was all very difficult for them to get these things, and they mentioned how solidarity was the most important thing for them getting out of it, and it was really hard for them. But even though they did that, they still developed all these vaccines. They also have a lung cancer vaccine and preventative medication for like diabetes amputation. So in the United States, it's very common to be amputated, have something amputated if you have diabetes. And in Cuba, they have developed this injection that you can take. And to be quickly, they also had people who were a part of the union, the medical union, represented in the talk. And also there are Communist Party representations in all of the hospitals to make sure that that the hospital and the community and the hospital are doing the best they can for the people. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Can you actually move on to the next slide? I forgot to get rid of that one. That was a demo slide. But I am going to talk about, that was a draft slide, yeah. I'm going to talk about some of the politics of Cuba and the conversations we had regarding the politics of Cuba. There was two main conversations. Well, throughout the whole trip, we're having conversations on the politics of Cuba, including medical internationalism, military internationalism, just the healthcare system there, the police there, just interacting with people, constantly talking about politics. But two of the main conversations that kind of really stuck out to me about the political sphere in Cuba is the family code, or what they call it, the law of love, ley de amor. And that was passed, like I had mentioned, back in September of 2022. So just this recently, it's really new. I'm sure many of you, if you are on that leftist space on social media, you saw when it passed, and it was a big celebration because it's the most progressive code in the entire world regarding LGBTQ rights, women's rights, rights for disabled people, rights for the elderly, for caretakers, and surrogates. It won by a 66% of the popular vote with 75% of the participation. And everything I'm talking about here is from my notes that I took, sitting there in front of people, listening to them talk, the Q&A, all of that. So I just want to make sure people know this, that I'm not just getting this, I'm getting this from the experience that we had in Cuba, right? But yeah, so it passed through with 66% of the popular vote. And how did they do that, right? Like we were focused on that because we were like, what? How did you get, what did you go through to get 66% of the popular vote to vote yes on this? And they had like extensive public debate, discussions and education. They had over 79,000 meetings starting in 2019. They had, a laid out system of how they were going to roll it out so that everyone could get access to it, that they could get feedback, and then they could put out a new version. They had, I don't know if I said this already, but 25 drafts of the family code, 25 drafts that they, remade, and I think it was versions 21 through 25 were all public, meaning that like they were, nationwide drafts that like came in and came out. Everything before that was done within like law students, different leadership in the community, and different mass organizations. The main issues that like they pointed out to us that people had really questions about, like especially in like more conservative areas, more rural areas, traditional areas, the main issues within the family code that people wanted to talk about were the change in the concept of custody, same-sex marriage, adoption by gay people or non-hetero relationship people, surrogacy, and assisted reproductive planning. So those 5 areas were kind of like the areas that there was a lot of public debate, a lot of back and forth. And these debates, these sessions within workplaces, schools, neighborhoods, hospitals, these discussions were not so that the government could come in or a specific political party could come in and influence the way people vote. These discussions were literally just objective. They were just trying to get people to understand the terms. They were trying to get people to understand what the code would do, how it would change things, what it wasn't changing, how it was still just the furthering, I guess, ingraining of 2 fundamental laws, which they had already passed with their constitution in 2019, which is a right to non-discrimination and equality, the law of equality and non-discrimination, which was outlined in the new constitution they recently did in 2019. So it was just a reinforcement of that, and they were trying to explain that, right? It was very objective of what was going on in the code. It was not trying to influence it one way or the other. Some of the things that the code did, like I said, it legalized same-sex marriage. It guaranteed income for caretakers of children, so mothers usually, caretakers of the elderly and disabled people, and the importance of family mediation, inheritance, and domestic violence, the home life. All those things were like, they were outlined in the family codes that you could talk about that you had avenues to overcome those issues, right? It put in place protection for people in vulnerable situations, and specifically the ones that I've mentioned: disabled people, elderly people, children, women, victims of abuse, and the LGBTQ plus community, saying that they have a right to not be discriminated and to be treated equally. And one thing that it really established as well was established the right, like literal, a human right to live within a family, and the right to build and constitute a family, meaning you can build a family based on your terms, and you have the right to live within one. So you cannot be thrown out. So those are some of the incredible big things of the law of love. And I really, you know, I'm sure we will have these kind of Q&A sessions on the next trip. And I would, you know, if you are thinking about going, come so that you can experience it for yourself and ask those questions yourself that you have. Of course, we are here to answer those questions as well. But I just really want to, I don't know what the word is, hone in on the point that like, this was not just some code they passed, you know, they like put a law out. They said, you have 2 days to figure out if you like it or not, and then vote on it. You know, like they went into the community and saw the issues and explained it to them. They had law students, lawyers, judges, community leaders, mass organization leaders of different use different avenues to explain these things to the people. And I think that was what really inspired me. And because of this extensive process, this over 3-year process, the only way that this family code can be overturned, meaning that they don't have like some Supreme Court with 9 judges who can say, well, we're going to strike this family code down. No, the only way that it can be overturned is if they go through this extensive, long process of explaining the new code that they would put in place. So it would take a lot to overturn it. And one thing that we asked when we were in that Q&A, when we were in that discussion with community leaders, is if there's any opposition, if there's any group right now in Cuba that is trying to foment or organize some kind of overturning of this. And they said that we know of, no, because the vote has been so respected, because it was it had so much due process, right? Can I have the next slide, please?
Boa, may I add one thing on that too?
Yes, of course.
One of the things that I found pretty striking was that the lawyer had said that their goal was not to try and change people's mind. Their goal with having all of these thousands of meetings in all of the communities across Cuba was to explain the content of the law and the vulnerability of many of the communities that would be impacted by this change. So it wasn't something like we see in the US, where there's an effort to just shift public opinion in really like inflammatory ways. It was about education.
Exactly. Thank you so much for pointing that out. Here are some pictures of that little Q&A that we had. It was under this tree. The wind would blow in and out. It was really fun. You can't, I'm sure the screen, depending on what screen size you have, you can't really see who's there. But there was a, I can't remember the name exactly of the mass organization who explained it to us. And then they had members of different mass organizations like the Cuban Federation of Women, somebody from Cenesex, which is the Center for Sex Education, and for, I can't remember that, I think it was like male or gay men's rights group or something like that. But they came up and they answered questions for us, right? And then afterwards, we even got to mingle with a bunch of students who participated in those meetings that we were talking about. So can I have the next slide again? And the next political discussion that we had talked about race, and it talked about racism and discrimination essentially in Cuba, but also what they're doing to combat that, right? So it is called the Comisión José Antonio Ponte of the Unión Nacional de Escritores y Artistas de Cuba, which is the National Union of Artists and Writers in Cuba. So they kind of are in charge of that, But this program, this commission, the Aponte Commission, is under the National Program Against Racism and Racial Discrimination, which was something that was approved by the government in the same time that the 2019 Constitution was approved. So what this did is it established a commission committee, essentially like a chapter within each province of Cuba. And a province is kind of like a state, but I feel like though they're not really compatible. But that, if you need to imagine in a way, it's a region of Cuba. And they established an Aponte Commission in every province of the country. We got to speak with one of those chapters, one of those offices of the Aponte Commission. And we got to listen to them about their study, their work, and just like we're right now, we're trying to fit a bunch of information and give it to you in the most, in the best way. They were trying to do that too, because there's a lot of information that they were trying to give us. But what some of it does is it works in the fight against racism and the promotion of the African cultural legacy within Cuba. It studies and publishes on the assessment of the historical, economic, aesthetic, political, social, psychological, and cultural factors that favor the presence of racial discrimination practices in Cuban society today, as well as strengthens opportunities for their confrontation and definitive elimination. So they're literally working to end racism in Cuba, but they're doing it through studying it, through understanding it, and through tracing different things within that sphere, within that topic. It's named after, I just wanted to say this, it's named after an independence and anti-slavery leader named Jose Antonio Ponte, who actually led the first national conspiracy recorded in the history of Cuba against the Spanish colonial government. And so the goals of the initiative, and these are ones that they've outlined themselves: identifying the causes of racial discrimination, diagnosing possible actions to be taken by territory, locality, branch of the economy and society, disseminating the historical and cultural legacy of Africa, indigenous peoples, and other non-white peoples as part of Cuba's cultural diversity. Promoting, and then this last one, promoting organized public debate on racial issues within political, mass and social organizations, as well as their presence in the media. So these are like 4 very concrete ways of fighting racism and fighting like what we're used to here in the United States of like erasing, entire history, literal genocide, right? Erasing the horrible history of slavery or trying to romanticize it in some ways. They don't do that, right? Like they are very upfront about their history, and they're very upfront about how much of it has come from African, indigenous, and other non-white peoples. One question that was asked one question that was asked in the Q&A was, do Korean or do Asian, have they traced the legacy of Asian people within Cuba as well? And they're like, yeah, of course, that's part of our work too. And I just wanted to point that out. But yeah, so I just wanted to say all that. They have also studied, just as a last minute little thing, one thing they also studied was the relationship of America and Cuba. So like of African people, African descendant people in America and African descendant people in Cuba. And the way that relationship works. So they've really studied this. Like they've gone back to the lineage of African families for people who were brought over when they were enslaved, forcibly brought over, and have helped people find their lineage because of the extensive work that they do. But that is the time I have, and I hope that gave you just an idea of some of the incredible conversations we had. And I will pass it on. Also, these are just some pictures of that conversation.
Thanks, Boa. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about culture just briefly. And this is one of the art pieces that was in a community when we were on the way to see some youth. And so Shannon was one of our group leaders who's sitting in the chair with the other folks. Next slide. So one of the things that I want to share about this is that my understanding of how culture was playing out is that art, music, dance is seen not as like an extra thing or a separate thing, but as part and parcel to what it means to have the formation of a revolutionary politic. And so this played out in so many different ways. As a body worker, I had mentioned to some people that I was noticing that the like posture of people that I was seeing was like much more solid rather than like the slumped down vision that we often see in the US because of all of the pressures of capitalism and the many forms of oppression that happen here. And more people were comfortable being in their bodies, and that rippled out in the way in which children were encouraged to speak, to be able to participate. One of the presentations that we had, which was at the pharmaceutical company, before any of the scientists or the doctors spoke, they had maybe a 6 or 7 year old girl go up, and she shared for about 5 minutes. It was almost like she was channeling or just like sharing the story about the importance of the family, the importance of forgiveness, the ways in which we get sick if we are not caring for each other. And so centering children, not in a way that is just like, oh, what a cute thing, but like we actually want to give a voice and recognize that our culture is formed through our children. And so investing in people rather than investing in this like vision of a particular way to entrain people. That wasn't what I saw. And so these are just a couple of images. A little caiman that was at the Castro house in the top right corner. Revolucion, which is just like on one of the streets. And then at the very bottom, within the Santa Ifigenia cemetery that we went to, which is one of the cemeteries that has a number of the like revolutionary leaders on the eastern side of the island. There's this burial site, which is dedicated specifically for the people who had given their lives for internationalism. So the bodies that were returned from overseas. And then on the left hand side is the Madre de la Patria, the like mother of the country or the community, Mariana Grajales, who was one of the main people who was fighting for women's equality and ending slavery in Cuba. 2 of her sons were generals in the Liberation Army, and she and her daughter-in-law were like very crucial in those early liberation movements until she was exiled took exile in Jamaica after a number of people were killed. So next slide. Caimanera, primera trinchera anti-imperialista, one of the signs that you can see there. Caimanera is one of the communities that is in the shadow of the US-occupied Guantanamo Bay. And so they consider themselves the first trench against anti-imperialism or against imperialism. And so there are just a lot of ways in which revolutionary art is present anywhere that you go. And we were there over New Year's, which is the celebration of when Batista finally was forced out of power and the forces made their way into Havana. So that is celebrated as part of New Year's. Next slide. And go ahead and just play it, I don't know, 10 seconds or so. So, at almost every meal, almost every presentation, there was this incredible like sharing of music and art and an opportunity for us to like be in our bodies and to experience food, experience sound, experience like movement. Go ahead and go on to the next slide. And I just want to like appreciate that as an aspect of what life is like. There weren't a lot of ways in which we were necessarily seeing how the Catholic Church or colonization is still present, but it was very in my awareness in different images like the one on the far right of like, okay, how do Yoruba traditions align with Catholicism and the syncretism that can happen? So in the next slide, there's going to be a short musical sharing that we had in one of the communities. And I find it pretty interesting because, Kobe, if you want to go just like 15 seconds in to start there. Essentially what the leader is sharing about is Santo Niño de Atocha, which is one of the like youth figures of Jesus, but then also Elegua, who is like part of the Yoruba religion. And so just this understanding of how religions are coexisting.
Grandiosísimo niño de Atocha, escucha mi voz que te llama y te pide un auxilio en el nombre de Dios, el igual, abriendo los caminos del bien, de la paz, de la gloria.
And Kobe, we can go on to the next slide. Thanks for navigating all of the tech. It's so much. So just a couple more images here. And then you can go to the next slide. A couple of pictures of some of the food that we had. Continuing on. And then this is one of the groups that we saw of some young children who were dancing. And so again, like the investment in children early on and their skills, that this was accessible to people regardless of their race, their social class. There was a strong investment that if you are interested in dancing, if you are interested in any skill, like you will be supported by your community. So go ahead and play that.
Not error 5.
Error number 5. It was really good dancing.
They were so incredible. Like children who were, I don't know, 10, some that were even younger, like far superior dancers than I ever will be. But I think, you know, just one of the things that was present as well in some of the conversation with folks was that there's an awareness that the revolution continues all of the time in Cuba. And part of the way that that happens is by building deep culture and deep understanding of roots and heritage and why we do this work. And the fact that it's known that Yankee imperialism and like influence from capitalism is always trying to get at youth on social media, but that there's the commitment to continue investing in children so that they understand, you know, the supposed American dream or all of these individualistic visions of how to exist off the island are not actually based in reality. And the importance of, yeah, just showing what it is to continually exist. So we can do just a brief moment of this, which was one of the last music groups that we saw, and then I'll pass it on. Thank you, Boa. Take it away.
Thank you so much for that. That definitely brought me back, those videos. I was like, oh, wow, that was such a good time. And everywhere we went, we were just inundated by culture. But I am going to talk about volunteer solidarity labor that we did there, and which has been a part of the tradition of the Venceremos Brigade since the beginning. A huge history providing voluntary labor when in Cuba alongside our political education, community discussions, and travel. Over the years, brigadistas have done many things, including harvesting sugarcane, painting buildings, repairing structures, hauling construction materials, and a lot more. No matter what work projects are planned for a given year, there's always a valuable contribution for every brigadista to make, regardless of skill, experience, or ability. So it's really inclusive of different abilities, right, and different bodies. So for the 51st Brigade, we did volunteer work at an urban garden. And if I remember correctly, when they were explaining to us, it was one of the largest there in Latin America. I mean, one of the largest urban gardens in Latin America. Those are pictures from us literally working at that garden. We did a whole bunch of things there. We pulled out weeds, and we were pulling those weeds. We did so good. We pulled out weeds in like pulling them all out, and we also pulled out weeds in the specific areas where they were already growing things. We broke up manure, and that was kind of, it sounds horrifying because it's manure, but there were these huge piles that needed to be broken up and used as fertilizer, right? And we were there breaking it up, shoveling it into a wheelbarrow, and then putting it onto the same areas where we had just taken all the weeds out. So we were placing fertilizer as well. And then some groups, because obviously there's, like I said, there's different abilities, we're just picking tomatoes or moving rocks, or some even just hung out for a sec and were doing whatever they needed to do. But we did lots of different things within that urban garden, and it was honestly my favorite time there. Like, that was my favorite part of the trip, was being able to give back to Cuban society. I also want to say, as part of voluntary labor, one thing that I don't have on this slide, but that every single conversation we had, every single time we visited a commission, a center, a clinic, a school, we brought them a gift of material aid, right? Like, as Venceremos Brigade, we organized to bring so much material aid. Like, I don't think we put a picture up, but I have a video where I'm recording how many of our suitcases are material aid, and it's just like goes on. And every time we moved somewhere, we had to have a team of people figure out how to take these dozens of suitcases from one place to the other, right? Because we were bringing that material aid with us wherever we went, and then we were packing them up specifically to the area we were giving, right? So if we went to a clinic, we were providing medical supplies. If we went to a school, we would provide literally an entire hotel room full of material aid. Yeah, literally. And so that was an incredible part too, of us being able to give back and also show solidarity, because our government is the one who's blockading them, who does not allow them to have these materials that are necessary, from condoms to school supplies, to clothes, like whatever it was, literally the clothes on our backs, like the gloves we had, working gloves, elastic gloves, aspirin, all kinds of things. We brought it, and we brought it intentionally so that we could give to the specific groups and mass organizations and clinics that we went to. But we got to literally participate in giving back to the Cuban people for their hospitality. And the difference between the work, even the minimal work that we did there and the time we were there, because we were only there for 9 days, and you can only do so much there. It was so different. Like, you literally knew where the tomatoes you were picking were going to. You literally knew where the urban garden, who it was growing for, who you would be feeding. It was the schools, the clinics, and the different areas in that city we were in that would be fed through our work, right? We were not alienated from our labor. So it was an incredible situation. So yeah, the results of our work literally went straight to feeding people that we were in proximity with. Yeah, and so that is the end of my little thing on voluntary solidarity labor. Thank you. I'll pass it over to Kobe, right?
Yeah. Hey, y'all. This is making sure that my microphone is good. Here I have 3 pictures, and they do look a little bit disconnected, but I want to talk about revolution. And for me, going to Cuba was a real frame shift for how revolution is viewed, especially coming from here in the United States. So the first picture I have is actually a picture of, my dog's gonna pick right now to drink a bunch of water. So give me 1 second. Josh? So sorry, y'all. Actually, the statue of Oñate in El Paso. And this statue actually cost $2 million. Terrible timing. This statue also cost $2 million, and it's in front of the El Paso airport. And I included this for a variety of reasons. One, because this was actually the first statue that I that came into my consciousness. I had to fly out of the El Paso airport a lot when I was younger. And I remember that in 2006, when they started putting this up, there was a lot of talk about it. And I asked my family, why are they putting up a statue of a person who murdered a bunch of people? And my mom was like, I don't know. I can't tell you. The statue next to it is a statue in Cuba of Antonio Maceo. And this person is a revolutionary leader from the Spanish Revolutionary War. So when Cuba kicked Spain out, and he was a revolutionary leader from before that time. So before that successful revolution, he fought in the 10-year Spanish War. And this man was a hero for Castro and a lot of the other people who would continue on in order to overthrow Batista. And we consider revolution here in the United States as kind of like one thing. There's like one war, there's one act, revolution happens, and then when the goal is made, it's over. And Maceo, he was a man who fought with the idea of freedom in mind. So he was known for going into places using guerrilla tactics, and he would burn down sugar mills and he would free all of the enslaved people. And he fought a lot during the 10-year war with those around him because they wanted to still appease slave owners. Because they thought that, you know, if we, much like in the United States under Lincoln, if we appease everyone, maybe that'll work better. And he was very much of the idea that no, freedom is freedom, and there's a hard line there that you fight for freedom one way. And if freedom doesn't include everyone, then it's not worth anything. And that mindset went on to really inspire as they fought in that Spanish War going forward, when they realized that we cannot leave anyone behind. It went on to inspire Fidel Castro and the revolutionary politics of Cuba. It went on to inspire the family code, which we see that as they were doing drafts after drafts after drafts, at no point did they go, well, okay, this will be easier to get passed if we just leave the transgender people off, or this will be easier to pass if we drop the gay marriage, everything else should pass really easy. This became a thing of, well, in part of the ongoing revolution, no one's going to get left behind. On the right-hand side, I also included this street art. As we were going through, UC mentioned it a bit. There was a lot of street art, and this one is one of Che. This says, I think it says like, onward towards victory forever, something of the sort. I can't see my notes because I'm the one screen sharing. And there was so much street art that talked about revolution or revolutionary things. And for me, a big part of the frame shift was that revolution doesn't stop once the war is over. Revolution doesn't stop once you achieve what you want. Revolution is a continuous process, and it's continuously evolving. So the Cuba that happened after Batista was overthrown with Fidel, the Cuba from the 60s, the Cuba from the 70s, those have all been continuous revolutions that are still changing. The family code was part of this revolution. The Cuba making the vaccines and getting them accessible to people, these are still part of the revolutions. And here in the United States, we are fighting our own revolution. And even though it's not guns in the streets right now, it doesn't mean that what we're not doing is not revolutionary and that we're not trying to continue on with the process. And that way of looking at revolution. People continue to say this is part of the revolution. What we're doing is in support of the revolution. To say that the revolution is not, it's continuous, it's evolving, and it's something that everyone is working towards right now. And I think that was one of my biggest takeaways, is that the revolution doesn't stop, and neither does our work. So thank you. I'm going to go ahead and pass it now to my other comrades.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Colby, and I really, really appreciate that. Now we just have a Q&A session, and I just want to say we will have a little session to kind of process what your process, right? To be able to just think in a minute. We'll have some breakout rooms. Right now, it's more of a question and answer. We're just gonna let you, send them in the chat if you would like. If there was one you tried to ask earlier and wasn't answered, maybe you could send it now, or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you for you to be able to answer or ask questions about the Venceremos Brigade or Cuba. We will do our best. And one of us will answer, so.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Alyssa. So, my sister, like many years ago, not many, but but she went to visit Cuba, through some capitalist, touristy, way, and she said that there were still poor people, or I don't know, what's poverty in Cuba look like now? If it exists, I don't know.
I can talk a little bit about this if that's okay. Poverty is still a very real thing. Cuba is not a kind of utopia at all. And poverty is still very much in effect. For example, one of the doctors who was working with us, this wonderful doctor who showed up to my hotel room when I got really, really sick, gave me a shot in the butt. As we were talking with them, she mentioned that she also does hair or nails and eyebrows, because even as a doctor, it's hard to make ends meet, because no one there has exorbitant salaries, because it's a country that's living under an embargo, and it's literally living under constant threat from the United States. So what resources are there? They do go around, but they're not, it's not like flush with anything. Cuba is growing the majority of its own food. Cuba has, one of the things that I found really interesting is they have shops that you can only shop in if you're Cuban, and you have your national ID. And within that, they have set prices for things. So the price of rice is set as this, and there's no price gouging. The price of oil is set as this, and shops around the country cannot charge you more for that. So that the price of necessities, you have a set price. There are things basically set standards. So if you are trying to buy a home or own a home and rent, there are lots of ways that you get subsidies for that. The government will help pay for parts of that. And the same with many other things, but so it's trying to provide for everyone's needs, but there's still a lot of poverty. Coming from here, which is Cuba territory, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Sorry, y'all, my dog has just decided to act up as we're going through this.
You sound great, Kobe.
Thank you. The amount of unsheltered people, and it's a thing that our city is really reckoning with in terms of even just the conversation around it. At Cuba, we saw a few people who were unsheltered, but it was drastically different because their needs were at least being attempted to get met. So in doing this, I don't want to paint Cuba as this utopia where no one's poor, everyone has everything that they need, but it is a society in which people are being seen and that their needs are attempted to be met. And please, if anyone else wants to speak, go ahead.
I can maybe add a little bit, and please, if somebody else also wants to add, I'll try to keep this brief. But to add to that, prices, they try to, mitigate these prices and inflation and everything, but it's not a classless society, right? It's still in that process of socialism, and Cuban people understand that it is still a process of trying to, create. There is still wealth inequality in Cuba, but as far as like the houseless problem, we talked to one of the guys who is a part of the international friendship delegation, like ECAP. I'm forgetting the exact what it stands for, but his name is Idam, and he was talking about how there are definitely people, housing is not something that everybody can access because of the fact that the blockade makes it hard to get building materials like concrete and things like that can actually be that can withstand the hurricanes that happen every year and things like that. So although it's not there aren't enough houses for everybody, people don't die on the street. That's not something that happens, because you can walk into any medical facility and be seen for free. If somebody needs food, there are local restaurants that maybe don't have the best food, but if you need food, you'll get fed by these community restaurants for free. So it's definitely it's not perfect, right? It's still in the process, and that's what they understand, it's a process, and that the Cuban people alone should be the ones who determine and make those changes to get there. Whereas what the United States wants is for them to be like, oh, look, they're not perfect. Look, there's inequality. We should, influence their regime policy, and we should overthrow their government. So that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you so much, both of you.
Thanks, Alyssa. And then Sula.
Hi, this was so wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing this. I'm lying down and recovering from some medical stuff. So I have two questions. One is, this embargo clearly failed to incite regime change and all this stuff. So my two questions are related to the embargo. One, do you have a sense of what political purpose it still serves? And then two, to what extent is this embargo responsible for making this revolution more possible without, the evil the US stuff creeping in, right? That sort of dependency. I don't know. I guess I was curious about the interplay of that sort of economic isolationism and sort of the community development.
Thank you. I'll take a shot at this. But well, the revolution is ongoing, the regime change attacks are ongoing, right? Because we saw in I can't remember exactly what year, 2021, 2020, 2019. There were the July 11th protests that were directly influenced by American sanctions, right, and American blockade, right, as well as American propaganda through the Endowment for New Democracy, or whatever it's called, which is essentially CIA. But the point is that I would say it's still ongoing, right? And that memo that we talked about earlier about how they're literally trying to starve people so that they rise up against their government is still very much exactly what they're trying to do. That is still their their political line. That is still the United States political line. And I think that's why there's right now you'll see two kind of factions within United States politicians. One that says, let's ease the embargo, let's ease the blockade, this is inhumane or whatever, mostly because they want to be able to get economic, investment inside the country. And the other side that's hardline, let's keep starving them. Let's not give them anything. Anything we give to them just goes straight to the Communist Party of Cuba or whatever. So those are the two factions within the US government on the blockade. So it's still a struggle. It's still a struggle. It's an ongoing struggle. In terms of the interplay, like I mentioned, the United States, and one thing that we learned is the United States spends millions of dollars influencing and directly paying social media influencers in Cuba to kind of give out these conspiracy theories about how the blockade isn't real, about how, that if you move to the United States, if you leave Cuba, you will have this rich, full life. A bunch of lies that they, are hiding what's going on in America through these like social media influencers online. It's kind of crazy. Like, it was kind of crazy to to learn about all this. But that back and forth is something they're dealing with right now. Something we learned about in our trip in December and January, right, in this month. About how they're trying to combat the contradiction that there is a lot of young people leaving Cuba. There just objectively is a lot of young people who are leaving Cuba right now. And like, that is why they're investing, and they have been investing more and more on the culture, and the dance and the art and the education and the ability to participate in society as a member of it, right? To win themselves to Cuban society and to the internationalism. But yeah, so I just wanted to point those two things out. It is a back and forth. There is still very much a lot of shit going on.
Can I hop on a question that I saw in the chat ball?
Yes, of course.
This is a question a little further up that came a little bit ago, that was talking about curious about the process of trying different things and learning things that didn't work. Like, quote, we tried that and it did not work well, and this is how we do things this way, or if these things feel like experiments. And I think like one of the things that reminds me of, because I think as a lot of us have mentioned, Kobe made it really clear, like they very rarely just said the word, the people that we spoke to very rarely said the word revolution in past tense. It was usually, the phrase that I heard most was revolutionary process. They like consistently viewed it as a process. And so I think like that framework, at least to me, feels like experimentation. Like, we're trying things, they're not going to work. As someone mentioned earlier in the chat, like Fidel Castro was like, yo, we were like really shitty to the gay and queer people in the beginning of this revolution. And that was like, I owned that, and like we will try and do our best to make it better. So that's one example. Another example that was brought up a little bit was when the USSR fell. I think, as Boa mentioned, like the USSR was Cuba's biggest trading partner, but like by far. And all the sugarcane that the USSR would buy, like, they couldn't sell that anymore. So they thought that might have been the case. And so for decades before that, they had been experimenting with how could we grow stuff how could we grow enough food for the people in Cuba using only inputs from Cuba, not buying fertilizer from the USSR, not buying chemicals and things to like help with growing. And that foresight, I think, is possible, because of a socialist production model, because it wasn't dependent on market forces. It was like people being like, hey, if this ever happens, we need to have a plan for that. And so they could put aside money and resources to figure that out. Where in a country like this, like that's not a thing that happens much. And as we saw with the pandemic, like we are still reeling from this enormous social medical shock it's a disaster. And so that foresight feels related to that question of experimentation. Like, hey, if we ever need this, we have it, and it helped. Like, it's like the special period was really difficult, but it was made easier by the fact that they had a plan to build a bunch of organiponicos, is what they call urban gardens, across the country, to change what was once a pretty much monoculture growing sugarcane into a place of diversified vegetable production for the benefit of the people in like a pretty short period of time, because of the amount of research that was done to do that. And that was really striking to me.
I would say one other place that comes up for me was just recognizing that like the Communist Party came out of the fact that there was an attempt to have different political parties, and then a recognition like this actually isn't functional. So we're going to shift into a model of governance that is theoretically one party in control, but it's not the same way that happens within the US or a lot of Western countries, where you have the illusion of choice, but essentially just two different parties that are putting out the same message, or like have the same ends but different messaging. The Communist Party became something that's like, all right, like how do we choose people at community level, and then from there they can choose people who are at like a higher level. So it's really like a tiered process. And I think that was one of the other ways that there's been this like experimentation of like, all right, we tried this other system that doesn't work for our context. We're gonna like shift it around to see if something else works. I'm hoping that I actually got that right. Feel free to correct me if I didn't. And I know that we're at 3:30, so I don't know if we want to take a final question, or if we want to move into the demands, Keegan, your call.
I think if folks are down, another question or two would be awesome. If folks want to hang out, also no pressure either way.
I could add on. Oh, no, go ahead, please. Someone had something to say. No, please interrupt. All right. Okay, so I just wanted to add a couple of things. Steve made me think about, yeah, they mentioned that in Cuba, like the two-party system ended up being that like two different parties were just ended up fighting for their own interests, whereas the one party made it so that they actually focused on unity first, and then that it actually makes it possible for them to get everything that they need to get done. Like that's why it worked for them. And then something that Keegan said, oh, and now I'm forgetting. So come back to me because I'm forgetting now, but you know, that happens.
A thing that I was just going to mention is that this was something that I did not fully understand until relatively recently. The Cuban Revolution, again, I'm saying this as the overthrowing Batista, Fidel Castro, you know, the communist movement. That was, again, a war. It was a movement. When people left that, a lot of those people, very specific people, came to the United States, and very specific people came to Florida. During that time, rich people, and especially middle class people, and especially landowners, were the people who mostly came to the United States. They were very upset that their land was taken from them. Even Castro's mother was very upset because Castro's family, he grew up rich. He grew up with a lot of land. And after that, the revolution, he divided up that family's land among the people, which angered members of his family, especially his mother, which is a thing that not a lot of people talk about. Other people whose land was taken were very angry. And a lot of those people fled to the United States. Now, the United States, as they were letting people in, were very selective about which Cubans they let in. Whenever the United States, or whenever Cuba was like, anyone can leave Cuba, you're free to come and go, the United States then put a very strict restriction upon who can and cannot enter. And in fact, the people who they decided they did not want any more Cubans to come, they actually sent them straight back to Cuba, but instead held them in detention in Guantanamo Bay. That's a whole nother rant that I could go on. But allowing people into the United States that fit their message was very important to them. And that population now lives heavily in Florida. And until recently, I did not realize how big of a voting bloc that was in Florida, and how playing to that voting bloc has become a very Republican tactic. And I was not sure why Florida Latinos were such a big Republican sway until recently. And I had no idea how much that had to do with Cuba. So Trump really tightening restrictions to Cuba, really tightening the embargo. These are all things that were coming from this whole big interplay of things that I had no idea were connected. And those were all plays that even Biden is currently making. He said that during his run for presidency, that he was going to open up trade again, open up remittances, allow people to send money back and forth. And then he's as he got into office, he's also trying to, he wants to win Florida back, right? Florida is up in the air, you're trying to win that back, and that stuff starts tightening again. So as soon as it becomes a political chess piece, people start hurting Cuba in order to get their wishes. This was something I had no idea, I didn't understand. I probably did not do it nearly enough justice, but hopefully that helps to answer some of those questions. Does anyone else have another question?
Yeah, any questions from non-presenters and also I appreciate everyone who's spoken and kind of given a little more nuance and information on that. But any last question from anybody who's interested in the Venceremos Brigade, wants to come,
I've got.
Go
Sorry,
ahead.
I have one more question. It's not about that. Just did you meet any trans folks in Cuba, and did you talk to them about their
Of
experiences?
course, yes, we did. In fact, at the family code discussion, we had a trans woman come up and like literally speak to us. She was just in the crowd. I hadn't noticed her until like somebody was like, "Oh, do you guys have anybody that is trans here?" From like somebody from the brigade asked, "Do you have anybody who's trans that could speak to us on these issues?" And she stood up and she spoke to us, right? And then alongside, there were a couple of trans folk, of course, just that we got to meet. But yeah, there definitely was. And it was different too, because and this is what I'll end on and we'll move on. But one of the questions that we asked this woman, and I forget her name, but was like, what is discrimination like? What is the experience of being trans in Cuba like? And she said, honestly, we still have issues. We still are discriminated against, but it's not a survival thing. Like, and that's one thing that I noticed, right? Like, it wasn't like, as a trans person, I have to fight to survive because I'm going to be murdered on the street. I'm going to be deprived of a job. I'm going to be deprived of shelter. I'm going to be deprived of food and safety. No, like that was not what they were fighting for. They were fighting for interpersonal discrimination. And that was the main issue that she pointed to as the issue. So we'll end the question and answer there.
Being Boa on that as well. She had uplifted one of the ways that trans people are impacted by the embargo, and that's that there's not enough testosterone and there's not enough like testosterone blockers. Like a lot of the trans care doesn't get through. And the impact that can have is that when you have a limited supply, sometimes it's going to go to trans women or trans people. Sometimes it's going to go to other things where that might be used, like people who have prostate cancer. And so she had just mentioned how there were these impacts that we can tie back to the embargo.
Yes, to the blockade. Thank you so much for tying that back, because it's very, very important. She absolutely did say that. And I'm not sure who has this slide.
I got y'all. Okay, we're gonna bring it home.
Oh, you muted yourself.
Hit the wrong button. In the chat, I just put in the Venceremos Brigade's points of unity, which have a slightly different articulation of the demands that the Venceremos Brigade makes on behalf of, or like with our partners in Cuba. So those demands are, one, that the US end the blockade on Cuba. You've heard a lot about why it's like a literal life or death thing for a lot of people in Cuba based on restrictions, food, medicine, fuel, among many, many other things necessary for survival. The end of the illegal US military occupation of Guantanamo Bay, which has been in the news for years and years for egregious human rights abuses, but is also literally just like the United States illegally squatting on Cuban land and pointing guns at Cuban people because the United States can. The removal of Cuba from the US state sponsors of terrorism list, which as I can't remember which comrade, but people have mentioned, it does not allow for Cuba to trade with many people because of their inclusion on that list. The end of all restrictions of travel to and from Cuba, and the end of all US-led and US-backed attempts to overthrow the government of Cuba. If the people of Cuba decide they want to do that, that's their business. The United States should not be pouring millions of dollars into sneaky funds that they can't trace back to the CIA to try and overthrow the government of Cuba. We wanted to also just like, I know people have. Should I read this quote? Okay, I'll read this quote. So this is just talking about giving some context for why solidarity with Cuba is really important and life-giving for both as a mutually life-giving relationship. This is a quote from We Are Cuba, How Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World by Helen Yaffe. So to survive after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Cuban government has pursued many different strategies. One is to, quote, nurture the revolution's global solidarity networks. With groups now active in 2/3 of the world's nations, the solidarity movement became a safeguard of the revolution, an element of our people's national security. According to Genia Serrano, president of the Cuban Institute of Friendships with the Peoples, ICAP, between 2009 and 2017. The Solidarity movement is autonomous, genuine, and authentic, inspired by Cuba, but not built or led by Cubans, Serrano said, which I think is reflected. I'm not sure if any of us here have Cuban ancestry. An act of solidarity from within the United States has been strategically important. So, you know, this trip I mean, you've heard a lot, certainly not all of the ways that this trip was life-changing for us. We super encourage you to think about perhaps going or finding ways to be involved. Oh, nice. UC just dropped that we have a coloring book that we developed in coordination with lots of different folks last year to help fundraise for the Venceremos Brigade. We still have copies available. The link is available on Etsy, and also if you DM us on our Instagram at anti.war.abq, we can help you get one of those. We also, you know, will be accepting monetary donations to help folks go to Cuba the next time at our Venmo. And yeah, super encourage folks to think about going, to engage with people in your communities about things that you've learned here, about questions that you have here that you want to, you know, still follow up on. And I think I'm going to leave it there. Does anyone have any other things by way of closing? Go ahead, Alex.
Thanks everyone for being here and listening to this, you know, over to almost, yeah, an hour and 40 minutes. So I just thank you guys for coming, and hopefully we'll, you know, be in contact, and you will keep being interested in the Venceremos Brigade.
We have our Instagram up there. BOA has their Instagram up there. The VBs, so please follow it. We'd love to see y'all go yourselves to have this experience. And if you have any more questions, just hit us up. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Come on the 52nd.
Take good care, everyone.
Bye, you all.
Bye. Nice to see you, John.
Bye, John.
Bye, y'all.
Love to everyone.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.